In this video, you are going to learn how to configure SSO on the Legacy Control Hub. Let's begin. Before starting, please note that configuring SSO on the DataOps platform follows a completely different process that will be covered in another video. There are two actors in the SAML scenario: the identity provider, IDP, and the service provider, SP. The identity provider asserts the identity of the user, while the service provider consumes the assertion and passes the identity information to the application. Control Hub SAML integration supports SAML 2.0 and supports SAML sessions initiated by the service provider only. This means that Control Hub does not support sessions initiated by the identity provider. Enabling SAML authentication involves registering StreamSets as a service provider in an identity provider and configuring SAML authentication for your Control Hub organization. For the purposes of this video, we will walk through the basic steps required to set up SSO in our Control Hub organization using Okta as the identity provider. Let's start by creating our application in Okta. Click on Applications. Create App Integration, select SAML 2.0, provide a name for your application. In the general settings, we will configure the single sign-on URL and the audience URI properties. The single sign-on URL is where the SAML assertion is sent via an HTTP post. The audience URI is a unique identifier that is the intended audience of the SAML assertion. Let's keep the other default settings. Now, here in this case, the first option will be selected, but this depends on each use case. Let's proceed to assign the app we just created to at least one user. Go to Assignments, Assign, and assign one of our users to this application. Finally, we only have to download the IDP metadata that we will later use to configure SAML in our Control Hub organization. In order to do this, go to the Sign On tab, right-click on Identity Provider Metadata, and save the metadata file to your local computer. And with this, the configuration on the identity provider side is done. Now we will proceed to configure SAML on the Control Hub side. Note that in order to perform the following steps, you must be a user with the organization administration role. With that being said, let's access our organization settings. To do this, we go to the menu, click Administration, and in our organization, we click on the gear icon on the right side of the screen. Here we see two tabs: SAML IDP Metadata and SAML IDP Options. To configure SAML, we can manually fill in each of the fields from the SAML IDP Options tab or upload the metadata file that we have downloaded from our IDP. Uploading the IDP metadata XML file configures most of the required properties that Control Hub needs to connect to the IDP. However, for some IDPs, you must configure individual properties in the SAML IDP Options tab. Some examples of IDPs that require setting individual properties can be found in our documentation. Let's take a look at the SAML IDP options for a second. Now, in the case of Okta, we just have to make sure to uncheck these three options that we find at the end. Also, it is important to mention that when we use both tabs to configure the IDP, the properties configured on the Options tab override any of the metadata uploaded to the Metadata tab. Now that everything is correct here, let's go to the SAML IDP Metadata tab to upload the Okta metadata. We click on File, we select the XML file containing the metadata, and finally we click on Save. Click on the organization name to display the organization details. Check the SAML integration enabled property and click on Save. Now the next step would be to configure the users that will use SAML. To do this, we go to the left menu, Administrations, Users, and select the desired user. In the SAML username property, Enter the IDP user account to map to this Control Hub user account. Since our user is configured with their email in Okta, we don't need to change the default value in this case. With this, we have completed the SAML configuration in Control Hub. Once SAML has been configured for our users on both sides, IDP and Control Hub, we can proceed to login. To do this, we must, as always, enter our Control Hub user ID, which is made up of the user's ID and organization, separated by an @ symbol. Click on Continue. As we can see, we have been redirected to the login page of our IDP. Once here, we enter our IDP credentials. Click on Sign In, and this finally redirects us back to Control Hub. What do you do if something goes wrong with the SAML configuration? For example, the SAML IDP is incorrectly configured within Control Hub and users cannot log in using SAML authentication. In these cases, users with the Organization Administrator role or the Control Hub authentication role can use the following link to log into Control Hub using Control Hub credentials. Note that for this reason, users with these roles must always define a password to use with their Control Hub user account, even if they also use SAML authentication. To summarize, in this video you've learned how to configure SSO on the legacy Control Hub.